Hi. In this video, we're going to take Apple's canonical SwiftUI sample app, Scrumdinger, and bring it to Android as a fully native Android app using a tool called Skip. Skip takes your Swift and transpiles it into Kotlin and adapts your SwiftUI into Jetpack Compose. As a result, you can have a single shared Swift and SwiftUI codebase that powers both a native iOS app and a fully native Android app. Skip is primarily used for new development, but in this video we'll see what it's like to take an existing iOS codebase and bring it to Android with Skip. If you're not familiar with Scrumdinger, it's a sample SwiftUI app that Apple uses to teach developers SwiftUI. It's about 1,500 lines of code. It's interesting in that it exercises a lot of the built-in SwiftUI components, but also uses some custom drawing, and it takes advantage of Swift language features like Codable for persistence. Now, if we were to go through the entire SwiftUI Scrumdinger sample, it ends up being hours long. It's divided into little sections, but if you go through the whole thing, it takes quite a bit to get through. So we're just going to jump to the end and download the final version of that. We'll go into the complete version and open it in Xcode. The first time you do, you might have to trust it. And if we sort of expand things out, you can see it's a reasonably sizable app. Nothing too big, but not too small either. So let's go ahead and run this in the iOS simulator so we can see what we're bringing to Android today. And there it is. So it's a list of programming, like agile scrums typically used for programming. So we can use to scrum 1, you can set a meeting length, you can choose a theme, and you can add attendees, Abe, Mark, Sarah, and so forth. So there's our scrum. Once you have one, you can go in, you can re-edit it, you can start the meeting, and as you can see, it has sort of a timer going, showing our progress, and it shows who is speaking. We can advance it, and it uses custom drawing. Once you're done, it persists a little history of the various meetings. So that's the app, and now we're going to bring this to Android. Our first step to do so is to get Skip. So you can get Skip from our website at skip.tools. There's documentation, including getting started. And this will bring you through the process of installing Homebrew if you don't already have that, and using Homebrew to install Skip. One of the big steps involved is making sure that you've downloaded Android Studio, because if you're going to write an Android app, you do need to have some way to run it, and Android Studio includes emulators. So before we even start with the Skip side of things, we want to get an Android emulator running, because when Skip builds, it's going to attempt to build as both an iOS and an Android app, and it needs somewhere to run your Android app. So there's an Android emulator, it's starting up. We can hide that. Now we of course already have Skip installed. I'll make sure it's at the latest version using Homebrew. Yeah, latest version already installed. So with that, we are ready. And our first step there is we're going to create a new Skip project. And this will be our Scrumdinger clone. What we're going to do, if you have an existing iOS library that you want to make a dual platform library that supports both iOS and Android using Skip, it's fairly easy to retrofit the existing package. So Skip uses Swift Package Manager. It's pretty easy to add in some instructions that tell it how to use the Skip plugin, and bam, you can take your existing library and have an Android version. Existing apps, however, are a lot more complicated. The Android build relies on a certain folder structure, a certain Xcode project configuration. Very hard to take an existing app that has an Xcode project, and as you know, that file format is opaque. It's very difficult to deal with. We can't just migrate that over to a dual platform app. So what we recommend you do is you create a new Skip app, which we'll do in a second, and then we'll import the code from Scrumdinger into our new app, and then just run it from there. And that way we'll have this dual platform version of the Scrumdinger app. So to create a new app, there's a skip init command. We're going to go ahead and tell it to open Xcode when it's done. We give it an app ID, typically reverse DNS, and we're going to call it Scrumdinger. And then we give it, I'm sorry, we're going to call it Scrum Skipper. Scrumdinger is the existing one. We're going to differentiate ours. We'll tell it the project name and the name of the app. Okay, so it's going to go ahead and go through a bunch of steps. It's going to resolve dependencies. It's going to basically get everything ready to build both an iOS and Android version of this app. And that can take some time depending on what sort of dependencies it has to download and so forth. Okay, it has created Scrum Skipper. Now, obviously, we have not imported any code into this yet. This is just the default project you get when you use skip init. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and run it to see that everything is working. So the first time you run it, it's going to ask you to trust the skip plugin. We'll go ahead and do that, and now it's building our first skip project. As you can see, there are Android and Darwin folders. The Darwin folder is where you'll find some of the stuff specific to iOS. And the Android folder, the opposite, but most everything is going to be in these shared sources. And what we start with is a single content view. And as we'll see as it builds, it's going to just present a simple tabbed interface. And it's just meant to provide a template. We're going to actually end up deleting all of this and replacing it with the Scrumdinger code. So the first build can obviously take some time because it's also got to build all the skip libraries because, as you know, Swift Package Manager distributes things in source form. So it's currently building all the skip libraries. This is not typical of what you see when you iterate. Okay, the build has succeeded. It is launched in our iOS simulator, and it has launched in our Android emulator. And I wish this thing were easier to move around. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, skip apps are not pixel identical. We're using Jetpack Compose on Android, so you get the native Jetpack Compose look. You don't get some sort of uncanny valley sort of replica that you see in a lot of cross-platform frameworks. We're actually using the native UI frameworks on each. But you have the same sort of components. You have tabs, you have lists, you have navigation, and each one is using the native components for the platform, but the platforms aren't that far off these days. You even have access to things like dark mode on each one. Okay, so as I said, we're not actually going to keep this around, but it's good to see that things are working as intended on both platforms. So what we're going to do, we will put Scrum Skipper over here. And what we're going to do is take Scrumdinger's code and just move it over. So let's collapse the models and views. We will take those folders and put them into the Scrum Skipper source. And the last thing we have to do is all this code in the window group that is not contained in those folders. We're just going to copy it into our content view. So we will replace the template code with the code from Scrumdinger. Place that body. We no longer need these tabs. And there we go. So we've copied over all of Scrumdinger's code into Scrum Skipper. We shouldn't need Scrumdinger anymore to run it. Okay, so we can now just concentrate on Scrumdinger itself. So moment of truth, we will attempt to run this new version of the code, which with all of Scrumdinger's original code, Swift and SwiftUI, let's run it as a dual platform app. And the build failed. Here we go, we get this helpful error message, we highlight it, and in line it's telling us, showing us a couple of errors. First, it says color raw value, so the color constructor that takes a string, basically a named color, says is not available in skip. Consider placing it within an if skip block. Okay, what is that? Well, we'll explain in a second. And the second one tells us that the Kotlin enum base type has name and ordinal properties which cannot be overridden. So we can see that this theme enum in the Scrumdinger code has a name property. And this is telling us, well, in Kotlin, there's already a name property attached to every enum, and you can't override it, so there's no way to translate this into Kotlin. We just have to rename this property. And so let's circle back to this color API being unavailable. So this is our first sort of hint that although skip is really good at transpiling your Swift into Kotlin and adapting SwiftUI and Jetpack Compose, not every iOS API is available yet. And so running into this API is not available kind of error is a pretty common thing. And it tells us that it's not trivial to take an iOS code base and just move it over. Now, if you're starting a new project, as I said, that's sort of what skip is designed for right now. It's very easy to take these errors one by one and just avoid that API, or as we'll see, create an alternate Android code path. And if you just get them one by one, it doesn't really slow you down too much. If you have an existing code base, however, imagine that skip translates 95+% of that code base. 95% is a lot. That's saving you a ton of work. But that is still, if 5% of your code suddenly gives errors, that can be dozens or even hundreds of errors to deal with at once. And that's why it's difficult to move an existing code base over. Now, it can be a slog. There's no sort of shortcut. You do have to work through these errors. But remember that it's still, if you're working through 5% of your code base, that's still 20 times better than 100% rewrite for Android. And in the end, what you end up with is a single unified code base in Swift and SwiftUI that's really easy to iterate on from that point forward. The other really cool thing is that unlike a rewrite, when you adapt a code base to skip, you're not risking regressions to the iOS version. As we'll see, we can leave the iOS code perfectly intact and just find alternate solutions for things that aren't supported on the Android side. So you're not risking any regression to your iOS version. You can still use any iOS API you want. As we'll see, on iOS, we can still use these name colors. It's just that you need to find some fallback for Android. So how do we do that? Well, the error message mentioned using something called an if skip block. And this is all covered in the skip documentation. But basically what it allows you to do, as I mentioned, is it's a compiler directive, and you can use if skip or if not skip. If not skip means you're on iOS. If skip means you're on Android. So if not skip, we'll just continue to use our named color. But if we're on Android, what do we want to do? Well, for now, we'll circle back to this. For now, let's just use some constant color. So we won't support the themes yet. And then we'll go back at the end, and we'll figure out how to get themes working. So we've made those two changes. We've seen how we can leave our iOS code intact with if not skip, and then provide an alternate Android code path if we need to, which allows us to just move forward. Let's get this building on Android. Let's get it working, and then we'll worry about making sure that every feature is back. So we fixed those first two errors. We'll move on. Oh, we immediately got a problem because we no longer have a name. We have a theme name. And now we build again. We get another API not available. This time it's timer.tolerance. Well, you know what? Timer.tolerance, not that important. So we'll leave it in place on iOS, but let's just omit it for Android, right? We don't actually need that. We just need a timer. Do we really care if its tolerance is 1/10 of a second or 100th of a second? Or no, we just need it to count off seconds for us. So we'll just move on from there. And we start to get additional things, this time about speech recognizer not being supported. So yeah, the speech recognizer and AV Foundation frameworks are not yet supported on skip. We actually do have the beginnings of AV Foundation. Some things are supported, some things are not. We're not going to mess with it here. We've actually gotten some really good user contributions around AV Foundation. So that one's actually moving pretty quickly thanks to user contributions. It's actually pretty easy to contribute code that enhances these frameworks or supports additional Apple frameworks on Android. But as I said, let's just skip it for now. Actually, let's just skip this whole thing. We won't worry about speech recognition yet. So I'm going to start speeding up this video, but this is sort of the pattern of things. When you're initially trying to get something working, just comment out the stuff that doesn't work for Android. I'm sorry, not comment out. If skip out it. So it's still going to work on iOS. We just won't support it on Android yet. And then you can circle back once you've got things building and deciding which features you actually really need for Android and which ones you can just sort of let go. So there's one kind of error I do want to show you. I'm not sure if I'm getting any of them yet. No, not yet. As I said, I'm just going to go through and if not skip things, wherever I need to. Right now it's complaining about speech recognizer because we took that out of the Android build. So we'll make sure every use of the speech recognizer is for iOS only. I'm going to speed up the video. We'll go through all these. When I find what I'm looking for, we'll slow it down again. I'll show you what I mean. Here it is. It was the very next error. So I wanted to show you that the same if not skip trick works for SwiftUI modifiers as well. So you can just take out an individual modifier or use an else here, if not skip else, if skip, use a different modifier for Android. It's not just on code blocks, it also works on modifiers. And I wanted to show this one in particular because this is an accessibility modifier. We're actually very proud of our accessibility support. As you can see, it's not complaining about accessibility label not being supported. It's not complaining about accessibility value not being supported. We do not support accessibility element. There's no sort of faithful translation that we found of that into Jetpack Compose yet, but we do support a lot of accessibility modifiers, and Skip's strategy of using Jetpack Compose, using the native UI on Android, means you actually get a very good accessibility story. Your iOS accessibility works as expected. We're not taking anything out there. And on Android, you're using their native accessibility, which is very good as well. A lot of cross-platform frameworks that try to write their own UI layer, accessibility sort of becomes a second-class citizen. It really suffers. They're not good for accessibility. Whereas Skip, using the native UI toolkit on each platform, it really is an advantage in that respect. Okay, now back to the sped up video. I'll keep continuing to fix all these errors and get back to you when we have something that builds and runs for Android. Success! We have built a skip. Here is the iOS version starting up, and the Android version. Obviously, we don't have any scrums yet. The iOS version is intact, as I mentioned. It's going to work just as before. The Android version, well, the basics seem to be there, right? So let's do just Scrum 1. Give it a duration. We know the theme picker isn't going to quite work yet because we hard-coded that color. But let's add attendees. Okay. Well, sort of works. We obviously have some problems with some of the images not showing up. Yeah, I'm missing a bunch. If we start the meeting, that doesn't look right. We used to have that nice custom drawing of our speaker progress and so forth. So obviously it still needs some work, but we have it building, and that wasn't too bad. It didn't take too long at all. We can see it did record the history, so that's nice. So the good news is that as we go through, we'll pretty easily find what's broken, and it turns out, spoiler alert, that it's going to be fairly easy to fix all these issues. We'll start with the images being missing, because that's a common one. As you might expect, if you're an experienced iOS developer, Scrumdinger uses SF symbols for most of its images, actually for all of its images. The only reason that some things, like this little person here, are showing up in Skip already, this little plus symbol, is that Android includes a few images of its own, and we've mapped certain SF symbols to the built-in Android images, but it's a much, much, much smaller catalog. So Skip actually allows you to import vector images, and if you just give them the correct symbol name, it'll use that whenever you reference, it'll use the corresponding, that image to any sort of API that expects that SF symbol. So if you do system name on a label or system image on a label and you give it the string, plus.circle, it'll look for that vector image instead of using a built-in SF symbol that obviously doesn't exist. So what you can do to import SF symbols, we will go here. I'm sorry, I should also tell you what happened in that sped up portion of the video. It turns out that we have to use those if skip, if not skip blocks about 25 times in the 1500 lines of Scrumdinger code to get to this point where things build and launch. And as you saw, there were a few other changes necessary, things like changing that themes, enum's name to theme name. You can go through the blog post, it'll tell you the details, but on the whole, not too bad. 25 if skip blocks and 1,500 lines of code. That's a pretty good success rate, 98% or something. So how do we do those symbols? We can see in our sources, we have resources, and we have this module asset catalog. So what we have to do is just drag vector images into there. And for the purposes of the demo, and it's up to you what you want to use, we'll just export the actual SF symbols from Apple's SF Symbols app and put them into our Android app. So you can do that fairly easily. Let me see what kind of symbols we need. For example, we need calendar. So if we search for calendar, there it is, file, you can export the symbol. We'll put it in our Scrum folder. Export. If we go to the Finder, there's calendar SVG. We can drag it into that module. And if we ever reference the calendar string for a SF symbol name in our code, it will now use this on the Android version of the app as well. So again, I'm going to speed up the video. I'm going to go and do that for all the symbols that we need. The way I found these, by the way, is just looking for cases of API that uses system image, which is how a label refers to a SF symbol name, or system name, which is how if you use an image in SwiftUI, it refers to the symbol name. So I just looked for all those, I recorded which symbols I'm going to need, now I'm going to import all those. See you in a minute. Okay, we've imported everything. If we run it again, this time we should have images. Now we should have some images. Let's see. Yes, that looks promising. And we have some images. We still have some work to do, but that was a good first step. Now let's move on to a few other fix-ups. One of them is, where is our custom view here? Well, that is from the meeting view. Okay, if we look at the code, what we're missing is the meeting timer view. Now, occasionally, and it is actually fairly rare, you'll see a layout problem like this. It is just a layout problem. For some reason, the meeting timer view just isn't showing up. Well, how do we want it to be? We want it to just fill that space. So let's just do an if skip and add some code that will only apply to the Android version. And how do we fill space in SwiftUI? We say that max width is infinity and max height is infinity. That's how we tell something to fill space in SwiftUI. It wasn't necessary on the iOS version. For some reason it is on our Android version. Again, that's kind of rare that there's a layout difference, but it does occasionally happen because there are differences between SwiftUI and Jetpack Compose under the hood. We can also see, just from restarting a couple times now, that our scrums are not persisting, so that'll be the next thing we fix. But let's see if this one worked. There it is, much better. So this screen actually is starting to look a lot like its iOS counterpart. So let's fix persisting scrums, so we don't have to keep creating one every time. And then I'll speed up the video again. I'll fix a few remaining issues. Again, you can consult the blog post for details, but it will only take me a couple minutes, so you'll see it as a few seconds of sped up time. First to persistence. So where does that happen? I believe persistence happens in the scrums view. Yes, so you can see that it is accessing the scene phase, which tells you whether your app is in the foreground, background, or inactive state. And it's saying on change of scene phase, when it goes to inactive, we're going to save. And that's actually our problem, is that for Android apps, there is no inactive state. Android apps go straight from foreground to background and back. So we'll just use our trusty skip We will leave our iOS code just as it is. But when we're running on Android, we'll save on backgrounding. So let's try that and see if it works this time. To Scrum. Okay, it's there. Let's background the app. Let's just rebuild it, rerun it. That'll force it to quit and start again. And it's back. So saving now works. Our custom drawing here now works. And we are well on our way. So I'll speed up the video, fix a few remaining issues, and we'll look at the end product. And here we are. We can now edit, choose themes. So we can go back to yellow for that one. We can make another one. We'll use purple. Say Bob and Jen are at that Scrum. And we have a fully functional Scrumdinger app. You can see that purple uses white instead of black. And we know that, we did change a few things. We didn't, for example, support speech recognition. And that would be something where you take advantage of the fact that Skip allows you to bring in Android libraries. You'd find a speech recognizer Android library and integrate it that way. But we do have the basics of Scrumdinger working as a fully native Android app. And it's valuable just to take a second and reflect on that. That's pretty amazing that we took this Swift and SwiftUI code base, and in a matter of minutes, I did speed up parts of the video, but I believe minutes to maybe an hour, made it a fully functional native Android app using Jetpack Compose, using Kotlin under the hood. And although we did remove a few features in the process, we did not compromise the iOS version at all. You never have to compromise your iOS app with Skip. And over time, if we decide that some of those features are important, we can add them to our Android app. And again, without risking the iOS side at all. And if we want to make changes to both versions, we now have a unified Swift and SwiftUI code base to do so. So if you're interested, again, the link to the blog is in the description. If you want to evaluate Skip, it's free to try. Go to skip.tools, and I'll see you in the next one.